everybody. Is the mic? Yeah, the mic is working. I've never done this part. Usually I just shout. That's how I teach. Hi, and welcome to all of you today. Today we're going to be looking at the history of abortion rights in America. We're at a point in American history, as you all know, 9 months ago, the Supreme Court decided in the Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization that a woman's right to choose, which had been enshrined in Roe v. Wade, had been overturned. And we're in a period of time of great tumult about how we're going to deal with this decision and what rights women do have under this court decision, and how this will work now that the regulation of abortion is at the state level. What we want to do today is look at the history of abortion through the lens of the Supreme Court decision in Dobbs, talk about how the rights to abortion have changed over time, and then contemplate a little bit, as I said before, where we are today in terms of state bans or state legalizations of the right of women to choose. So I'm going to begin by just giving you an overview of the Roe v. Wade case and the Dobbs decision. Oh yeah, you've got it. So in 1973, the Supreme Court legalized abortion in their 7-2 decision in the case, now famous case, Roe versus Wade. The court decided that the unenumerated right to privacy, which was implied in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, protected abortion as a fundamental individual right. This right, though, was not unlimited, and it's important to realize that the Roe case did not say all abortion is legal at all time. The Roe case had some limitations to it, particularly in the later stages of pregnancy. So outright bans to abortion or limits on abortion were acceptable unless it violated or it put into risk a woman's health or her life. But in the early stages of pregnancy, this was a fundamental right that women had. And for 49 years, women and families have organized their lives around this basic idea. In June of 2022, the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. The court's decision, and I have it up here if you can see it, written by Justice Alito, argued that the only legitimate and constitutional unenumerated rights, like the right to privacy as implied in the 14th Amendment and used in Roe v. Wade, are only those, quote, deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition, end quote. Abortion, the majority held, is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition, and thus is not such a right. The justices based this claim on their interpretation of history. However, in an amicus brief submitted to the court, the AHA, the the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians, which are two of our historical societies and organizations for those of us who teach history, have argued that the court's narrative arguing that abortion rights are not deeply rooted in the nation's history is historically inaccurate. Today, Professor Moe and I have 3 goals. First, to make the historical argument that women's rights to control their bodies in the case of pregnancy is deeply rooted in American history and tradition. And second, Professor Moe will explore why over the late 19th and 20th centuries, this historic right changed over time. Something that was first allowed became restricted, and then with Roe, we re-enshrined the idea of women's right to choose. And then today, here we are with the Dobbs decision. So that changed over time. Finally, we'll discuss the consequences of Dobbs and where we stand today. So my job in all of this is to introduce these things, but also my purpose is to look at the colonial period up through around the 1840s and to illustrate the ways that the right to choose is embedded in America's nation, in our history, and in our law. So as we consider the question of the history of women's rights to end a pregnancy, we need to start with a quick review of how the law viewed women in colonial America. The basis of colonial laws was something called English common law. English common law was the collection of laws established in England that established women's rights and other things. That collection of laws was brought by English colonists to North America and became the basis for colonial law as well as the laws of the United States. Those laws established the status of women in colonial America. The legal system that was established is called coverture, or the Latin phrase femme covert, which means woman covered. In English common law and in colonial law, femme covert or coverture defined the status of women in society as covered legally by their husbands. So in that sense, women had no right to own property because their husband controlled their property. Women didn't have rights to earn wages or participate in politics, among many other things. Husbands also retained the right to use physical violence against their wives' bodies in terms of punishment and so forth. So that means that in English common law and in femme covert and in colonial law, to a large extent, women's bodies were not their own, right? So all of these limitations existed. However, there was one place where this was not true, and that place was in the area of women's pregnancy and childbirth. In this arena, women's voices and authority were recognized by both tradition and by law. Sarah Evans, in her book, Born for Liberty, illustrates the centrality of women's authority in the area of childbirth as she describes the tradition of childbirth in New England colonies. She says this: childbirth in a village was a female ritual. At the start of labor, the midwife, neighbors, and kin came and stayed with the woman through her travail, that is her childbirth, and for several days afterward, while her husband, says Evans, for once, remained on the periphery in his own home. So when childbirth was going on, move the man out, women are central. The ritual was female. The process of childbirth was driven by females. Professor Moe will talk more about midwifery, but midwives were the ones that dealt with women's health. They were the ones that guided a woman through her childbirth and her pregnancy. And it was a female-dominated area, right? Nobody else was involved in all of this. But it wasn't just in the rituals of childbirth, the gathering together of women to help a woman give birth. But it wasn't just in those rituals that men yielded power to women. In the area of pregnancy, English common law and colonial laws that followed English common law clearly established the authority of women's voices, particularly to the right to end a pregnancy. English common law established a legal standard for when life began. It was called quickening. Quickening is the time when a woman first feels fetal movement. This usually occurs between the weeks 15 and week 20. So prior to quickening, so there's the prior to quickening period, and then there's a period of quickening. And sometimes during that period, you will feel the fetal movement for the first time. Prior to quickening, the law protected the right of a woman to end a pregnancy. So long before the writing of the Constitution, women clearly had a right to end a pregnancy or abortion. But it gets really interesting when we think about this idea of quickening and when a woman first feels fetal movement. How is that decided, right? In English common law and in colonial law, the decision was the woman's. She told us when fetal movement began. She was the authority of where life begins and where we mark the end of one period and the beginning of another. The time of quickening is determined by the mother. No midwife determines it, no husband determines it, no doctor determines it, nor a lawyer or a government official. The woman's voice is central in this moment. After this moment of quickening, colonial law and English law allows for restrictions on ending a pregnancy. Prior to this moment, determined by the woman, the right to end a pregnancy was hers. So this is really interesting when we think about the idea that the right to abortion might not be deeply rooted in the history and tradition of America. The woman made these decisions. In fact, just sort of an interesting piece, the word abortion, you noticed I wasn't using the word abortion, I used the phrase ending her pregnancy, and I did so for a reason. The word abortion was not used when a woman ended her pregnancy prior to quickening. The word abortion was only used for miscarriages after quickening up until the mid-19th century. So it's kind of an interesting piece of how we label what this is. In fact, ended pregnancies were often called a pregnancy slipping away. That was a description that was sometimes used. Another description that was used in the ending of pregnancy was restoring the menses or restoring menstruation. Women viewed the idea of a conception as the blocking of menstruation, and the return of menstruation was the ending of a pregnancy, right? So there's this sort of sense of there's nothing wrong with doing this prior to quickening, right? Thus, neither miscarriage nor a deliberate ending of a pregnancy were criminalized in our early history. Leslie Reagan, in her book, When Abortion Was a Crime, tells us that, quote, restoring the menses was a domestic practice. The power of certain herbs to restore menstruation was widely known. One colonial woman who feared pregnancy had, quote, according to her, twice taken savin, once boiled with milk, and the other time strained through a cloth to end a pregnancy or restore her menses. Other herbs could also be used and were readily grown in herb gardens and collected from the woods, end quote. Indeed, in the colonial and early national period, advertisements for abortifacients, that is, herbs that could end a pregnancy, as well as medical abortion, indicate that ending pregnancies was relatively common and certainly not criminalized. This historical evidence indicates that when it came to reproduction, the law and society assumed the woman's basic right to bodily autonomy at the time of the writing of the Constitution. So again, when we look at Justice Alito's notion that there was not an embedded right to abortion at the time of the Constitution, we know that that's factually incorrect. However, in the mid-19th century, women's reproductive rights came under scrutiny for a variety of reasons. Some were focused on women's health, while other, more profound limitations occurred in response to the changing status of women in American society. Some of the first laws passed in the United States involved the commercialization of abortifacients. Do you have the next slide? Just so they can see some. Oh no, go to the next one. I forgot that was there. So some of the commercialization of abortifacients, and there's a couple of ads that the New York Historical Society kindly put up online so I could grab them. In growing towns and cities, women didn't always have access to a garden to grow the herbs needed to end a pregnancy, nor could they go out into the woods and gather things. So they began to rely on pharmacies to provide the kinds of things they needed if they were going to restore their menses or end a pregnancy. Unfortunately, as the commercialization of these tonics or pills began, the people who were making these abortifacients often put dangerous ingredients into the mix, or sometimes just put some random thing into it and said, here, this is going to help you. A rash of deaths in the 1840s of women who had attempted to end a pregnancy and either sickened or died led states like Illinois to begin to outlaw these commercial abortifacients as a way of preserving women's health. So in these cases, the question wasn't whether a woman, what she was doing was legal or not. There was no question of this. The outlawing of abortifacients, and thus outlawing abortion, if you want to take that stance, was not done except in the case of the health of the mother and to avoid them using things that might kill her. Other cultural changes, however, and political changes that are taking place during this very period of time are going to begin to make changes in this basic historical and traditional right to abortion. And this is where I turn it over to my colleague to take up the story of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. All yours.
I want you to notice that it doesn't say abortion. And so if you didn't know what they were, yes, you wouldn't know to buy these things because they're not labeled. And I think that's done on purpose. Okay. Could you move back? I don't know how to move backwards, so she'll figure it out eventually.
This one?
Yes, yeah. I think that's mine, yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two different periods. And as I was listening to Professor Kerr, she made me think about all these things. But one thing that I want to mention is, okay, so we're historians, we talk about change and change over time. And, we often have arguments with another historian who is now our dean, Curtis Martin, and he would say, you know what, history never repeats itself. And most historians would say that, it doesn't repeat itself because it's always a little bit different. And that's true. But what I like to say is that, well, yeah, it might not repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot. And so what I look for are these kind of parallels in history because, otherwise we can't learn from history. And that's one of the things that I want you to start thinking about. What are the parallels as I talk about the 1850s to 1950 and then the 60s and 70s and then maybe even today in terms of how I sort of set the story up for you. So in the late 19th century, there are three things of concern that work in conjunction with one another that gives us the experience that we have during the late 19th century. One is the rise of gynecology. It is a brand new medical discipline. You don't really have men practicing, obstetrics before the 19th century. So it's brand new, and they're just kind of figuring their way through all of that. The other thing that's happening, and it really is marked by mid-19th century, my women's history will know, 1848, Seneca Falls Convention is the mark of the first women's rights convention. And you have this movement towards a demand for basic rights. So you have suffrage and women saying, hey, we should be allowed to go to college. We should have professions. We shouldn't have to wear corsets, so that you have all these rights, language coming out, women sort of asking for a change in how they were restricted in the 19th century. And all of this culminates in this term that we use to represent this woman by the end of the 19th century. We call her the new woman, because she's very different than the Victorian woman. And we'll talk a little bit about Victorianism in just a moment. So that's number two. So rise of gynecology and women's rights and other kinds of women's activism going on in the second half of the 19th century. And the third thing is a rise in nationalistic movements in reaction to what was seen as way too many immigrants who don't look like what we imagine an American looks like, as well as the kind of racism you get during Reconstruction period and the rise of Jim Crow. So anti-immigration, xenophobia, racism on the rise in the second half of the 19th century. So those are three things that are kind of happening all at the same time. I did want to say a little bit about midwives. Midwives, they did a lot. They weren't doctors. What they were obstetricians, they were physicians, they were nurses, they were pharmacists, a maid because a pregnant woman going through labor can't clean the house or feed her children, so she might step in and help with that. They were morticians. They understood the rituals of burial. And that's because pregnancy is the most dangerous thing a woman would go through at this time. And so she understood those things. She probably comes from the culture, so she can speak their language, as well as understand the different rituals. And so what she did was know her patient. And these are relationships that were built because you're from the community. and they knew each other. And when you have that kind of relationship, you tend to be more supportive of one another. And that's really important, that relationship, that medical relationship between midwife and I can't just say woman, because the midwife did all kinds of help. She helped when your children were sick. She helped when your husband was sick. So it wasn't just women's health. Okay, so we have, on the one hand, this long tradition of midwifery, and on the other hand, this brand new discipline that's really male-based. Because I can tell you that, to become a doctor is really different in the 19th century. It took about a year and 3 months. And with the new gynecology discipline, it's not like they had a long tradition of understanding of women's bodies. And I have to say, so the style of men at the time is that they don't necessarily listen to women to get their knowledge. So it's not like they're going to the midwives and learning from the midwives. So you have this other kind of thing that's beginning to grow. The mid-19th century is sort of like the height of the Victorian age. And the ideal of Victorianism, the ideal woman is this woman who is pure and genteel and innocent. She was like Mary. She was both a mother and virgin at the same time. Really hard to do in the 19th century. But that was the idea. That's what she needed to emulate to be a true lady. And lady is the term, the operative term here, because that is the kind of sort of context that we're talking about. You're talking about women, they're talking about ladies. And this was also a period in the 19th century where biology becomes part and parcel of knowledge. So what do I mean by that? This is a period where people are studying criminology. And they do that through the new study of phrenology, which is the study of the shape of a skull to see how criminal a person is. So linking people's behavior to some kind of biological cause. And that's what they did with women and gynecology. This brand new study about women. And so women, if she wasn't normal, right? If she didn't behave in the way that she was supposed to in the 19th century, like these ladies, like these pure beings like Mary, maybe she liked sex with her husband. She's not supposed to like sex. She's too innocent. Maybe she spoke too loudly. Women should be very quiet. Maybe she wanted to go out shopping on her own. Women are not supposed to be in the public space. Women who go out in the public space on her own are literally called street walkers. And so you begin to see this kind of connection. So if this lady does not behave in the way that she was deemed naturally to behave, then they figured it was some kind of biological problem. And women were described as being defined by their genitals. So if there was something wrong with her in her behavior, then there must be something wrong with her genitals. And gynecology, by the time you get to the second half of the 19th century, sought to fix her with clitorectomy, oophorectomy. So most of you know the term clitorectomy, which is cutting off of the clitoris. But oophorectomy is the removal of healthy ovaries. And sometimes if that didn't work, then they might cut an ovary out of another woman and try to put it in this woman to fix her problems. And that was part of the problem. There were diagnoses. Like, for example, prostitutes were often diagnosed with nymphomania. And so the argument is not that these women are trying to survive in economic perilous situation, but rather that she chose because she's some kind of nymphomaniac, and that's why she's a prostitute. And so what we see in the archives of medical diagnoses in the second half of the 19th century is that these medical diagnoses seem to be more about controlling women's bodies when she seemed out of control, when she was not behaving in the way that she was. And as you get closer to the turn of the 20th century, what we see is a rise in demand by women for the rights I talked about earlier, and a rise in the medical industry against that kind of behavior. For example, in 1871, there was a report in the American Medical Association Committee on Criminal Abortion. They described the sort of woman who sought an abortion. And she was described as, and this is a quote, unmindful of the course marked out for her by Providence. And then went on to talk about women who sought abortions as selfish and immoral. And so, again, it has to do with her not fitting into these sort of Victorian notions of what it means to be a true lady at this time. Now, abortion, until the 19th century, as Professor Kerr was talking about, wasn't really seen as a problem. There was one man, Horatio Storr, who began to move against abortion. It was a personal crusade of his. And due to his work between 1860 and 1880, you have a rapid number of anti-abortion legislation, and in part it has a lot to do with his work. And most of this legislation forbade abortion except for to save a woman's life. At the same time, you also see lots of regulation on birth control. In 1873, you have the Comstock laws, and this is pushed by Anthony Comstock, who was a post office master and made sure that anything that was, well, he was really mostly focused on birth control. He found that obscene, and so birth control and abortion were defined as obscene material and therefore cannot be sent through the mail. And so Comstock laws were basically your obscenity laws, right? And so both abortion and birth control information was considered obscene. Now, you saw that there were ways to buy abortifacts. Is that how you say it? Abortifactions. There were also birth control things, like the early versions. The closest I can call it is like a diaphragm, but you would need to know that you were buying a womb supporter. And if you didn't know that, you had no access to these things. And birth control and abortion was a woman's issue. It gave her power and control over when she would get pregnant. And the late 19th century, like I said, marked major changes at this time. She's demanding rights like suffrage. Women are coming out and striking for better working conditions. So she's doing that out in public. She's marching for suffrage. The early 20th century, teens, 20s, marks the first sexual revolution in the United States. And women are coming forward and say, hey, we matter too, so this is about orgasm and satisfaction and all. And so really unseemly stuff for people who are like ensconced in Victorian notions of proper behavior. And there was even change of dress. Women weren't taking off their corsets, and the clothing was lighter, thinner. It's not dragging on the floor. It's not going all the way up your neck. And so all of these changes to regular folks, they thought that women were out of control. And so there will be this very negative general popular attitude about the new woman at this time. What's really interesting, I think, is, so this is also, at the turn of the 20th century is the rise of the birth control movement, and most people know the name Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger spent her life, devoted her life to bringing birth control to the world, really. But most people don't realize that when Margaret Sanger started her work, she argued, and this is because birth control was so important to her, she said that abortion's the wrong way. birth control is a better way to prevent that from happening in the first place. That was Margaret Sanger, which is really interesting because I also think about the Catholic Church was really against birth control at this time, and I can't remember the name of the bishop, but there was this bishop who always fought with her, and he said, okay, yeah, abortion's wrong, but birth control, and this is a quote, it's satanic. In other words, birth control is so much worse than abortion. And he argued that it's because, you are stopping the hand of God. And so I find it really interesting the way we look at abortion and birth control today, and then you just go back and you don't even realize what people are saying back then because context is just a little bit different. Okay, so I'm sorry. So the church didn't really see life until quickening. Actually, they called it animation. Animation happened when a boy fetus entered its first month, I think it's about 30 days. And animation for female fetus happened twice that. So, about, 60, 80 days, something like that. So it's interesting how these things change. It is in the late 19th century where the Catholic Church changes to the view that life begins at conception. But before then, historically, and the Catholic Church is really the only one that seems to have a problem with birth control first and then abortion second. That will change when we get to Roe, but Professor Kerr is going to talk about that. Okay, so we have, on the one hand, the rise of gynecology, on the other hand, women's rights, and those changes happening in the 19th century. The third thing I want to talk about is this other thing that's happening, which is this very sort of like anti-other. And those of you in sociology probably understand that term other, someone not us. In the 40s, you have the Mexican-American War, and the border crossed Mexicans. And then we had all these Mexicans here, and there was this question, what are we going to do with these people who don't look like us? At the same time, you have the potato famine, 1846 to 48. 3 million Irish people leave Ireland. 1 million of them all at the same time come to the United States. And so you have Mexicans, you have Irish. By the 70s, you have a massive German immigration into the United States, and then the 80s through to the early 20th century, you have people from the Southern Europe, Southeast Europe, so Italy, Poland, Hungary, Russia, so Catholics, Jewish, Eastern Orthodox, not Protestant. And you have the biggest wave of immigration that you've seen into the United States, and there was this huge fear of what's going to happen to all the white people, because those people who were coming weren't quite white enough. And so out of that fear was these studies done, and then they said, oh, look, Irish women have babies at twice the rate as Protestant, native-born white women. And that was part of the fear. What's going to happen to whiteness? Even though they're talking about Irish and Protestant white. And part of it had to do with, if you're an immigrant, you don't know these secret language of birth control and abortion. So you just have the babies. And so that was part of the problem, but that wasn't known, or they didn't really look at it. So this is a period of huge xenophobia and a rise of racism. I don't have to talk about Jim Crow. You all learned it in high school, right? So there's rise of that sort of perspective. And so the medical journals began to talk about how midwives were dirty and foreign and not modern, not up to date, that women who went to midwives were hurting themselves, and the medical establishment tried to get rid of midwifery, and by the 20th century they did. Midwifery was made illegal. Even though, and several journals point out, that they didn't actually have enough doctors to birth every woman who needed a doctor. And part of the argument at that time was because, sorry, I just lost my place. That's what happens. I get excited and then I forget where I am in my notes. So what was I saying? Midwives. At the time, yeah. Well, okay, I'm just going to have to pick a place and start again. Okay, so the medical establishment had complete control of women's health, of women's bodies. Women no longer helped each other in that because midwives were pretty much pushed out of this. And this is something that happened only in the United States. It didn't happen in Britain. It didn't happen in the other European countries. It happened here. And I want you to see how they associated the midwives with the immigrants. By 1910, abortion is illegal in every state. And even though abortion is criminalized, we see it criminalized in the 19th century, what we don't see is a decrease in abortion, and we don't actually see a rise in prosecution either. So we're looking at decade after decade, even though the law's there, you're not actually seeing people going after women. As we get, and some of the reasons is as the medical establishment takes control, they begin to create systems and bureaucracy in how to define abortion and what the laws are, and because the doctors not only sort of influence the making of these laws, they interpret it, right? And they put them into practice. Mostly it's doctors and the patients. So in the early parts of the 20th century, doctors and patients are having these conversations, and doctors know their patients, and we can say, look, there's a good relationship. They want their patients to survive. They want what's best for their patients, and so we don't see that reduction in abortion. And that's because abortion, what was allowed was both to save the woman's life and therapeutic reasons. Don't ask me what therapeutic means, but it's for therapeutic reasons. And you also have the 1930s, which is the Great Depression. And they add a third item to reasons why you can have an abortion. And that is, can she actually afford to raise this child? Because people are dying of starvation during the Great Depression. And so they say, oh, no, we should allow her to have that. So you see this early part of the 20th century, even though you have the laws in place, they're not actually sort of enforcing them. It's until you get to the 1950s, things change a little bit. Because by the 1950s, two things happen. One, medical understanding of pregnancy and its treatment of pregnancy is much more successful than before. It's not as dangerous as it used to be, like the 19th century. And two, they are so systematized in understanding abortion. And how that works is that you would have medical committees to decide on abortion cases, whether a woman can have an abortion without ever meeting that woman. And so you saw that abortion denial grew at this time in the 1950s. Okay. I just wanted to point out just a little aside. So you have in 1910 abortion being illegal in every state. By 2011, that's your period, right? 2011. You have a record number of abortion restrictions passed in states where Republicans hold the majority. In 2011, you have 135 pieces of restrictive legislation being passed in that year alone. Compare that to the year before, which was like 80 or something like that. And that's a decade before Dobbs. And so you can kind of see the writing on the wall, what's happening already before Dobbs came about. Okay, and I'm going to talk very quickly about Roe and how we get to Roe. All right, so you guys remember the late 19th century? I gave you three things to think about, right? Rise of gynecology, women's rights and women's voices moving up, and just a very sort of like racist period. So those are three things that are happening. In the 1960s and 70s, you have the second wave feminist movement. And then you have their companion piece, which is called women's liberation, which is the more radical version of feminism at that time. So, it's rising 60s and 70s, it kind of explodes. And women are demanding things for the first time. They're demanding equal pay for equal work because they don't have that. If you want a job, you went into the newspaper, you look, there's a men's section, there's a women's section. It could be the same job, and you'll see that they will have different pay. And that's because she had very few rights. She couldn't open a credit card in her own name. She could be sent home because she wasn't wearing the correct foundation underwear. Or if she wasn't wearing a dress, because she should be wearing a dress. Or if her makeup wasn't properly applied. If she wanted to buy a car or a house, she would probably be asked, "Where's your husband? I'd like to talk to him." Coverture was mostly still in place. She was still Mrs. John Smith. She did not have her own name when she got married. She had no credit rating. She was invisible. Literally, legally invisible. And that's what these women were doing. They're saying, hey, wait a minute, we want some equal rights here. And even the medical establishment, when they did their studies, they did it on male bodies. So imagine how medicine is being used and applied to women's bodies. Women, by this time, knew nothing of their bodies. They had no idea how the cycle worked. Just that it happened, and it's really annoying. But they just didn't know. So, these feminists started pulling together clinics, health clinics, so that women could see health professionals who understood their situation. And in 1970, you have the publishing of Our Bodies, Ourselves. And for the first time, in popular knowledge, women got to read about what was happening to her. And Our Bodies, Ourselves not only goes through reprint after reprint, it actually goes out into the world because women in the world didn't know what was going on with their bodies. And this was a revolution in the 1960s and 1970s. And massive change was going on. You had women who were talking about these issues with each other, and then they bring it home into the kitchen, and they brought it into the bedroom. It changed everybody because it was so profound. And part of this fight, part of the path to Roe was the fight against rape. Because rape really wasn't truly acknowledged at this time. It was, in addition, in 1965, a study was made into the illegal abortions that were happening, and it's estimated about 10,000 women died from an illegal abortion a year. And so that's in the minds of people. These women talking about rape and being discouraged to even talk about it because it's an unseemly thing and it's a private thing. And then all these women dying from illegal abortion. And then the third thing that happened, and it's a tragic story, and it has to do with, in 1982, there's a widely used drug, thalidomide, which was used widely in US and Europe, and it resulted in phocomelia, which is infants being born with deformed extremities, or sometimes without extremities. And people were freaked out by this. And there was a woman who demanded an abortion, and the medical committee said, no, you may not have one. Now, she was able to afford to fly to Sweden to have an abortion where it was legal. And this story was really important to sort of pushing us towards Roe. The other thing that was happening at this time was that we had an epidemic in rubella, which also have major problems in infants when they were born. So we have the story of Norma McCorvey, and she's the Roe. And I'm not going to go into that because I'm checking my time, making sure that I'm seeing everything. But you have Roe. You also have Doe versus Bolton, which was also about abortion and decided on the same day. I will say this: Norma McCorvey, the Roe, and Sarah Kano, the Doe, both became pro-life people. So the two people who gave us abortion rights became pro-life. But Melissa Abel, Kano's daughter, if Kano would have had an abortion, had the right to have an abortion, her daughter Abel would not be here, and Abel is a pro-choice. So it's just this weird, complicated story, and then we're here in Dobbs, and I want you to think about it again. Think about the context I gave you. Women asking for rights, civil rights movement in that way in the late 19th century. And you have the civil rights movement here, and you have this conversation. And I think you have recently Me Too. You have all these other sort of women's issues sort of popping up. You go back to the late 19th century, and you have this rise in racism, this fear of loss of whiteness. I'm not going to say anything. I just want you to ponder that in terms of abortion and how abortion is used. Because abortion is not just about abortion. It's about so much more. Okay, so she's going to take over now. Tag, you're it.
There we go. So I'm going to take up the story. Professor Moe has sort of laid out this story of how the rise of women's demands for equality have led, and other developments in technology have led to more and more restrictions on women during that early period. But then with the civil rights movement and second wave feminism, we begin to see us circling back a little bit towards the ideas that have been existent in our early nation's history and even before that in the colonial period. So as I said before, what Roe did was it basically said that in looking at the history and also looking at the 14th Amendment, they looked at the idea of the right of privacy and said that the right to abortion is a right of privacy and a fundamental right. And what I think is fascinating about Roe is that Roe actually does take us back to that early idea of quickening, right? It uses different language, more modern and scientific language. Roe talks about the idea of fetal viability. That's the same thing as quickening, right? And it says before that time, the ending of a pregnancy is okay, right? And so when Roe comes along in this milieu that Professor Moe has talked about, this is this opening of a door back to the past when women's choice was center when it came to their bodies, particularly in early pregnancy. And I think that's just so interesting to think about Roe in that context as taking us back as well as moving us forward, right? Roe also, though, reflected the broad values of Americans in the 1970s. Just to give you some statistics, the Pew Research Center has reported that in 1975, so 2 years after Roe, Americans believed that abortion rights as defined by Roe should be legal, while only 22% opposed abortion in all cases. And these numbers remain roughly the same today. So we have a broad acceptance of the idea of the standard of Roe. Before fetal viability, ending a pregnancy is legal. And this is true, and people who have this belief crosses political lines. Democrats, Republicans, independents, other political parties. This is a broadly accepted idea, right? And this is, as I said, still true today in terms of American opinions. So that brings us to the question, if that's true and these are our values, how did we get to Dobbs, right? And that story is an interesting one, and I will do it fairly quickly just to give you guys some context. The story of how we get to Dobbs is actually a very long story. It begins with the rise of the conservative movement in the 1960s and 1970s. The conservative movement was looking for new people to join their ranks, particularly people who generally didn't vote very often. They were trying to expand their tent of their conservative values. And the group that they looked at, one of them anyway, were evangelical Christians who generally didn't vote very regularly. They saw themselves as a little bit outside the political system. To pull this group into political participation, the conservative movement focused on themes that were important to this particular constituency. The limitation and traditional gender roles, as well as limits on abortion, were two themes that really took hold and pulled these people into political participation. And as they became more politically active, they had a larger and stronger voice in the conservative movement, as well as the Republican Party that pulled them into that area. During the next 40 years, this coalition of evangelicals and conservatives created a small but very well-funded anti-abortion movement, protests at abortion clinics, worked, as Professor Moe said, worked to take the idea of Roe and find ways to restrict or limit even the rights that we had under Roe, were put forward and succeeded, as Professor Moe has said. And even conservative organizations like the Moral Majority, if you've heard of them, or the Family Research Council, funded a lot of these actions to try to find ways to make Roe less big, right? To restrict even more the rights that women had. But even as those restrictions came into play, there was a realization that if the achievement of outright bans on abortion to be achieved, which is what the goal of this conservative movement now was, that it couldn't be done except in overturning Roe. And so organizations in the conservative movement, including a conservative legal organization called the Federalist Society, began the work to promote pro-life judges so that who agreed that they would overturn Roe v. Wade and get them into the federal court system. And ultimately, the goal was to get them on the Supreme Court. Over the course of Republican administrations, the number of conservative pro-life judges grew. And in 2020, with the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, the court was ready to make that decision. And in June of 2022, the court came down with their decision in Dobbs, which said that the fundamental right of abortion that is enshrined in the right of privacy does not have a rooting in history and tradition. And I hope some of the things we've talked about indicate that maybe that decision was a little bit wrong, at least on that count. That ends sort of the history piece. What we thought we would do, and I know we don't have a whole lot of time, question and answer. Yeah. Okay, yeah, we were gonna show you guys some of the different, so since we hit Dobbs in the 9 months since, pretty much every state has done something with regard to abortion, right? And so we were gonna show you some material on that, but we have it actually in our links on the slide so you can go look at some of that information. But for now, let's just see what questions you guys have. Stand up. Ava.
I don't have a question.
Oh, here, wait, we got one.
I'll be back to Mike, so put your hand up and I'll get you next.
I was wondering how Roe and I forgot the other person's name, how they became pro-life after that ruling.
That's an Ava question. How did the Roe and Doe, how did they become pro-life?
Oh, Norma McCorvey. I mean, it's just a complicated story. I think she was courted, but she just felt that it was wrong, and she felt guilty because she lied. She said that she was gang raped, and she said this at a time: to be pregnant is to be ruined. And so a lot of people say, well, why did she feel that she had to lie? You know, what is the context of the period like that? Kano, because she had to have her baby and she loves her daughter, feels that she was glad that she was kept from having an abortion. That was her decision. And yeah, but it, you know, the pro-life side will actively look for women to join their side and articulate what would they call a more legitimate position based on who you are. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, hello. Forgive me if I'm wrong here, but I did remember reading about this. I believe it was Roe. When she was on her deathbed, she basically gave everyone her final thoughts, and she basically said that she was never truly pro-life, and that she only lied about that to actually receive
Funding?
funding.
Yeah, she got some money from that side. I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
Okay, so obviously the choice of the Supreme Court to criminalize abortion and take away our right to choice, it violates the right to privacy, but would you also say that the anti-choice decision of the Supreme Court is also a violation of our First Amendment right to freedom of religion?
Oh, that's a good point.
So I'm not a constitutional scholar, I will say that. I don't know, but one of the interesting things, and I'll kind of turn this a little bit, is the right to privacy has been used far beyond the idea of abortion rights, right? Mm-hmm. The right to privacy has been used as a support for marriage equality, right? It's been used in other ways as well. And the question that we have before us is a bigger one than sort of you suggest, okay, are there places where the right to abortion could be found elsewhere? And while I don't know that, what I would argue is that it is probably something we ought to pay a great deal of attention to, that the court has decided that the right to privacy does not exist as a constitutional right.
So your right to birth control is based on that interpretation, your right to privacy. So the pro-choice side will say that if they can reverse Roe, they can reverse Obergefell, which is the right to marriage equality, and then and they can reverse your right to birth control, and that is the direction, because right now, if you look in the courts, there is a legislative confusion of what constitutes birth control and what constitutes abortion. And so if they can say these birth control pills are abortion or abortive, then they're saying no, you can't have that because they can restrict, abortion via birth control, restricting birth control. So there are all these things. And of course, the more extreme arguments is that those people who are making these sort of originalist arguments, that Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruling that got rid of, or at least legally got rid of segregation, is also
Under threat.
yeah.
Yeah, because one of the things we didn't make clear, so my bad, because I skipped it, is that one of the things that Dobbs did was it didn't say, basically what it did is said that there is no constitutional protection that is blanket, right? So what does that mean? What it means is that this issue reverts to the states. And when Professor Moe talks about the idea of there's legislative confusion about a lot of things as each state takes a measure of what they think abortion is, isn't, what is contraception, what it's not. And we are in a period of time when it is very unclear where we might be going. It's clearer to see where states are going, but less clear in terms of how the courts are going to move if the right of privacy is gone, and the idea that states' rights should prevail in many instances is where we're going.
And let me just expand upon it. And I know we're out of time, so I'm just going to give myself the last word here.
Unless we have another question.
And feel free to stick around afterwards, because we're happy to continue to answer your questions. But the confusion is that the criminalization of a woman's body is really up for grabs everywhere. So women who have miscarriages, up to 26% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, are being arrested. In Texas, this one woman was arrested and charged with murder. Or there's this other woman who fell down the stairs. They didn't believe that she fell down the stairs accidentally, and she's charged. Or this this other, you ate poppy seed and you abused your fetus because you come up with the wrong drug test. And so, all these things are happening statewide, from state to state to state. And when I say criminalization, I say women are being accused and charged. And I mean, even if they're not, think of the type of environment a woman is experiencing, and if she goes through miscarriage, which is a much more common thing that we allow out in the public space. People don't realize that miscarriage is actually quite common. Ectopic pregnancies, the one that was in the fallopian tube, I think, what is the one out of, it's like a crazy statistic. I'm sorry. Do we have a doctor in the house? Maybe they anyway, I knew it, and then it's gone. So these are the kinds of sort of crazy confusion that's happening, and just the tone to live in this is frightening for women, because just being pregnant could, just something naturally happening, you could be charged with something. So anyway, we're going to stick around. We don't want to keep you because we're 5 minutes over. But your introduction took 5 minutes, so.
Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it.
Thank you to Professors Moe and Professor Kerr.